June 6, 1944, late afternoon, the fields of Normandy. A pall of smoke hangs low over the shattered hedgerows, the air thick with the acrid smell of cordite and fear. In the distance, a lone church bell tolls once, a mournful sound quickly swallowed by the grim silence of the battlefield. This was Normandy's hedgerow hell, a place where every field was a potential kill zone. Inside the cramped, sweat-drenched belly of a Sherman tank, a white steel coffin, 22-year-old Private Joe Johnson feels a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. The tight space is a chaotic jumble of machinery filled with the overwhelming smell of hot metal, oil, and the ever-present stench of fear. His fingers, slick with sweat, are wrapped tightly around the gear shift. A persistent ringing in his ears is a stark reminder of the last near miss. A German 88mm shell from an unseen anti-tank gun that had landed less than 10 feet away, showering their hull with a torrent of dirt and debris. Panic is a tangible presence in the tank. His crew is yelling, their voices strained with combat terror. The main gun is jammed. The primary hatch is refusing to budge, and now emerging from the tree line ahead comes an unmistakable deep rumble. It is the heavy final sound of a Panzer VI Tiger I, a steel behemoth that makes the very ground vibrate with each slow, deliberate rotation of its tracks. A true monster of German engineering and a feared tank killer. Joe hears Ellis, the gunner, his voice cracking. "We can't outrun it. That Tiger's armor is too thick." Mitch, the loader, is cursing, his fist slamming against a side panel in a futile attempt to unjam the breach. The tank commander has fallen silent, his wide-eyed stare fixed on the fog-shrouded fields before them. Somewhere out there, concealed by the mist, the Tiger is taking aim, ready for a one-shot kill. They all expect Joe to charge forward, to either confront the enemy head-on or make a desperate attempt to flee. But Joe does something that defies all military doctrine and expectation. He shifts the Sherman into reverse, initiating a desperate, unorthodox tactic. Without a word, he slams the lever back, and the tank lurches backward into the fog, its treads grinding and spinning, tearing up the earth. The crew's screams are not of pain, but of sheer disbelief. "Are you crazy?" one of them yells. Joe doesn't respond. His eyes are fixed on the side mirrors, his mind calculating every bump and dip in the terrain, every flicker of shadow. Just beyond the veil of smoke, the Tiger moves, slow, methodical, seemingly untouchable. What Joe does next will change everything. In the next 10 minutes, relying on nothing but instinct, courage, and a tactic no training manual ever taught, he will destroy not one, but two of Hitler's most feared Panzers, all while driving in reverse. And before this day is over, he will vow never to drive forward again. Before Normandy, before the Tigers, before the war turned verdant fields into infernos, Joe Johnson was just a farm kid from Seward County in Nebraska. Growing up, he developed an intimate understanding of machinery, fixing tractors with his father, learning the language of engines and the physics of weight and balance. He could reverse a John Deere tractor through a chicken coop without so much as knocking over a single bucket. But that was a world of dirt roads and diesel fumes, a world away from the horrors of war. When Joe enlisted in the summer of 1942, he didn't fit the mold of a soldier. He was tall but wiry, a quiet man who rarely raised his voice, a man who didn't drink or gamble. During basic training, his fellow soldiers dubbed him Slowpoke Joe. Later, the nickname evolved into something sharper, Backtrack Joe. This was due to his peculiar habit of backing up his tank in every drill, every maneuver, every live-fire exercise. His sergeants were infuriated. "Johnson, you going to win the war driving backward?" one of them had screamed during a training exercise in Louisiana. Joe offered no reply. He simply continued his unorthodox practice. To his superiors, this looked like cowardice, a dangerous underestimation, much like how German pilots initially laughed at the P-47 Thunderbolt, right before its 8.50s rained lead on them. While the other tank crews practiced charging forward, Joe would sneak away to reverse his Sherman, honing his ability to read the terrain in his mirrors, learning to feel the shifting weight of 28 tons in reverse. To the rest of his unit, this behavior looked like fear. His sole desire was to bring his crew home, every last one of them. So he studied. He delved into tactics, psychology, and German tank doctrine. He pored over field repair manuals, memorizing the weak points of the Tiger tank, the rear armor, the turret ring, the engine deck, until they were etched into his memory. He didn't speak of his obsessive research, he simply logged it all away. What they failed to understand was that Joe Johnson was not afraid of the enemy. He was afraid of making a stupid mistake that would get his men killed. And it was this fear, the right kind of fear, that made him careful, precise, and relentless. He knew the Tigers were coming, and he would be ready. By the third day after the Normandy landings, the battlefield had shifted from the open expanse of sand and surf to the deadly confines of hedgerows. The idyllic French countryside had transformed into a treacherous labyrinth for tanks. Joe's unit, a small convoy of 4 Sherman tanks and a single half-track, had pushed too far ahead, a dangerous overextension into enemy territory. Radio contact with headquarters had been lost, leaving them isolated and vulnerable. Looking at the terrified faces of French civilians hiding in the ruins, Mitch, the loader, muttered, "You expect a hero's welcome, flowers and all." The commander cut him off. "They're just scared. This isn't what we expected." It was a quiet shock, a rejection of the fantasy of being seen as simple liberators. Then came the sound. A low, rhythmic, mechanical pulse of metal on metal. Tiger. The German Panzer Kampfwagen, the 6th, the Tiger, was the most feared tank in Europe. Weighing over 57 tons, armed with a formidable 88 mm gun, and clad in armor that could shrug off anything short of a direct airstrike, the Tiger was a myth on the battlefield. The first shell hit before they even saw it coming. The Sherman on their left, call sign Red 5, erupted in a blinding sheet of fire and steel. The shockwave slammed into Joe's tank. Ellis, the gunner, cursed. "That was direct fire." "Tiger?" Mitch asked. The answer was terrifyingly obvious. Joe peered through the periscope and saw it, the hulking outline of an armored beast. The German tank was stalking them. Their own main gun was still recovering. They had maybe 20 seconds before the next round came. "We can't stay here, Joe. Forward now," Mitch shouted. But Joe remained motionless. He stared through the periscope, his gaze shifting from the enemy to the terrain behind them. He made his decision. He grabbed the gear lever and threw it back into reverse. The Sherman lurched backward. "Joe, what the hell are you doing?" Mitch yelled. "Hold on," Joe said, his voice calm but firm. "We're not running. We're creating an unauthorized firing pattern." It was a completely new way of thinking, using reverse not as a retreat, but as an aggressive repositioning to give his gunner the advantage. Another German shell slammed into the earth just in front of them, spraying soil across their periscope. The blast wave hit Joe's chest like a hammer blow, but his hands held steady on the controls. And in that moment, the German commander in the Tiger felt the first cold sting of confusion. This wasn't panic. It was a deliberate, calculated move. He was about to learn what the German high command was slowly beginning to understand across Europe. American power wasn't just in their numbers, but in their terrifying and unpredictable ingenuity when pushed to the edge. He could feel the terrain through the vibrations under his boots. The mud was thick and uneven, but the downward slope provided just enough cover. He expertly guided the tank backward through the smoke and dust, turning slightly so that the burning wreckage of Red 5 shielded their right flank. The Tiger fired again. The round tore through the space where Joe's tank had been mere seconds before. The impact flung shards of dirt and metal through the air. Inside the Sherman, Ellis whispered, "If we'd stayed." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew they would be dead. Joe didn't reply. He was too focused. The view through the periscope was a maelstrom of chaos. Trees, smoke, flashes of light, then sudden darkness. But Joe wasn't just observing the battlefield. He was trying to see through it, to put himself in the mind of the Tiger's driver. He was picturing confusion, movement, targets shifting through a disorienting haze, and a lone Sherman that refused to follow any expected pattern of attack or retreat. He remembered something his father used to say while teaching him to drive the old farm tractor, its gears grinding in the Nebraska dust. The trick to reversing isn't looking backward, it's knowing where you came from. Now those words pulsed in his mind like a steady heartbeat. Joe yanked the lever again, sending the Sherman sliding further into the fog. He cut a hard angle to the left, using the burned-out husk of Red 5 as temporary cover. The enemy crew, likely assuming they'd neutralized the immediate threat, began to advance, slowly, confidently. It was the way predators move when they believe the kill is guaranteed. "Loader," Joe barked. "High explosive loaded," Mitch replied, slamming the shell into the breech. "Forget high explosive," Joe countered, his voice sharp. "Armor-piercing, now." Mitch froze for a fraction of a second, his training screaming at him, then nodded, his hands already moving. "Copy that. Armor-piercing is next." The Tiger appeared again, a monstrous silhouette materializing from the smoke. Its 88mm gun moved with surgical precision, every motion slow, deliberate, and cruel. Joe could see the commander's cupola turning, scanning the wreckage for survivors. For a tense moment, the two machines faced each other across the hazy field, hunter and hunted. Only one of them was going backward. Joe dropped the clutch, and the Sherman jolted. The crew braced themselves as they reversed faster, weaving between smoking craters. Ellis kept his hands locked on the turret crank, following Joe's instinctual movements. "Joe, I can't get a shot from this angle." "You will. Just trust me." He drove by feel, sensing the slope of the earth beneath them. Mud clung to the treads, thick and heavy. The smell of diesel filled the air, acrid and suffocating. Every bump and lurch rattled the hull, and the engine groaned like an animal under immense strain. Still, Joe kept it steady. He was baiting the Tiger, making it think the Americans were in a panicked, disorganized retreat. Through the side mirror, he watched it move, that hulking shape crawling forward, its turret rotating smoothly to track their motion. Joe could almost sense the German gunner smirking behind his sights. "Come on," Joe whispered to himself, "follow me." The Tiger fired. The shell whistled past their hull and struck the hill behind them, exploding in a deafening roar and a cloud of dirt and flame. The heat washed over the Sherman's rear armor, and the crew coughed as smoke seeped through the vents. "That was close," Mitch muttered, his voice trembling slightly. Joe didn't answer. He reversed harder, faster, forcing the gears to whine in protest. Then, at the last possible second, he jerked the controls, cutting the tank sideways down a narrow, unseen embankment. The Tiger followed exactly as he had hoped. The German tank crept forward onto the slope, its gun depressing as it tried to maintain a line of sight. But in doing so, it exposed its weakest point, the thinner armor on the rear underside of its hull. Joe saw his opening. "Stop!" he roared. The Sherman halted with a squeal of protesting tugs. Mud splashed against the hull. "Turret, 9 o'clock, armor piercing." "Loaded," Ellis replied, already swinging the gun into position. Joe exhaled, a single steady breath. "Send it." The cannon's roar was deafening, the recoil shaking the entire tank. Smoke filled the interior, acrid and blinding. For a second, no one could see anything. Then, through the haze, a brilliant orange blossom erupted where the Tiger's rear had been. A direct hit. The German tank convulsed, then erupted again as its ammunition ignited. The resulting detonation rolled through the forest like a crack of doom, scattering birds and leaves in every direction. Fragments of armor rained down around them, hissing as they struck the wet ground. Inside Joe's tank, there was only a stunned, ringing silence. The crew stared at each other, eyes wide, mouths agape. "Did we just—" Mitch began. "Yeah," Ellis breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "We did." Joe didn't smile. He just watched the flames consuming the Tiger, the firelight flickering across his face, reflecting in his eyes like tiny burning suns. "Reload," he said quietly. "We're not done." The birth of a legend. News of the Tiger kill spread faster than the smoke from its burning hull. Joe didn't speak much over the radio, but word got around anyway. A Sherman had taken out a Tiger. In reverse. That was the part everyone repeated, almost like a punchline to a grim joke. "Did you hear?" Some guy backed into a tiger and blew it to hell. By nightfall, the name had already stuck. The Reverser. Joe didn't care. He wasn't looking for nicknames. He was thinking about the second tiger. They had pulled back to a temporary regrouping point, a hollow in the hedgerow hidden under dense tree cover. One tank had been lost, 2 others damaged. The unit's commanding officer, Lieutenant Cading, arrived in a jeep caked in mud, his face a mask of exhaustion and disbelief. "You really took out a tiger?" he asked Joe, the skepticism plain in his voice. "Yes, sir," Joe said simply. "With what? A lucky shot?" "No, sir," Joe replied, his gaze unwavering. "With positioning." Cading stared at him, trying to size him up. Joe didn't fit the hero mold. He wasn't loud or cocky. He just stood there in his oil-stained uniform, his face streaked with ash and sweat, as calm as if he'd just finished changing a tire. Cading looked down at the map spread on the tank's front hull. "We've got another tiger stalking the valley road. The Canadians are taking a beating. If you've got another one of those positions in mind, now's the time." Joe leaned in. He studied the map the way a chess player studies the board, seeing 5 moves ahead. "There's a shallow ridge here," he said, pointing with a grease-blackened finger. Refined Script, Part 4, The Reverser's Gambit. "If we loop through this orchard, we can reverse down the far side and hold this line. It's the only way we'll get a shot at its rear again." Cading raised an eyebrow, his skepticism palpable. "You're serious? You want to lead with your tail?" Joe didn't blink. "That's where the advantage is." The lieutenant stepped back, studying the young grime-streaked tanker before him. For a long moment he said nothing, the sounds of distant battle filling the silence. Then he gave a single decisive nod. "You've got 10 minutes." Joe returned to his crew. They were already prepping the tank, a well-oiled machine born of shared terror and trust. "Armor-piercing loaded," Mitch confirmed, his voice steady. "Turret recalibrated," Ellis added, "still a bit off-center, but she'll hold." Joe climbed up into the driver's seat. The controls were slick with grime, his own hands cracked and trembling slightly, but his voice was unwavering. "We're going to flank from behind," he told them, his words cutting through the tension. "We'll use the orchard for cover. Once we clear the ridge, we go backwards down the slope, slowly. I want that tiger thinking we're just another straggler running scared." Ellis let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You want us to look like cowards so we can act like killers?" Something like that. They rolled out with their engines low, the soft ground muffling the sound of their treads. The orchard loomed ahead, a skeletal stretch of gnarled apple trees. Their leaves were scorched from shellfire, the fruit blackened on the branches. Smoke drifted between the trunks like a ghostly curtain. The Sherman eased into position. Joe backed it down the ridge with practiced precision, his eyes flicking between the mirrors and the feel of the slope beneath them. Behind the ridge lay the valley road, and somewhere beyond that, the second tiger. Through the periscope they saw it, the massive silhouette of another German tank, angled slightly to the left. Its gun was pointed uphill toward a Canadian convoy stalled in a desperate retreat. They could hear the distant, frantic rattle of machine gun fire and see the faint red blooms of tracer rounds cutting through the mist. The tiger was in control, untouched, seemingly unstoppable. Until now. Joe kept reversing, slow, controlled, 1 foot of terrain at a time. The trick wasn't just to move, it was to not look like a threat, to look broken, panicked, like prey. "Almost there," Joe murmured, his voice a low hum against the engine's thrum. Ellis had the turret trained. Mitch stood ready with the next shell. Every muscle in the tank was wound tight, a coiled spring of anticipation. And that's when Joe saw it. The moment. The exact second when the tiger pivoted slightly to adjust its aim. The rear armor flared into view like a target painted by the hands of fate. "Fire," Joe said. The cannon thundered. To be continued. The second kill. The round left the Sherman's barrel with a sound that split the air like a whip-crack from the gods. A breathless, heart-stopping pause followed. Then a blossom of fire erupted at the rear of the tiger. A direct hit. But it wasn't enough. The shell punched through the grating above the engine deck, bursting into flame, yet the Tiger didn't stop. The beast shuddered, turned, wounded but not dead. Its turret began to swing around, slow, menacing, unstoppable. Inside Joe's tank, no one spoke. "Reload! Armor-piercing!" Joe barked, his voice raw. "Already on it." Mitch slammed another shell into the breach, his hands blistered from the heat. The turret groaned. Ellis twisted the crank, fighting against the resistance of hydraulics, sluggish from dust and overuse. The Tiger turned, now fully aware of the threat behind it. The Germans knew they weren't chasing ghosts anymore. This was no lucky shot. They were being hunted by someone who understood them. "Hold it," Joe whispered. The Sherman sat half-exposed on the slope, its rear tucked behind broken tree stumps, its front catching the firelight from the burning gash on the Tiger's hull. Then the German gun flashed. A shell screamed past, missing by inches, and struck a stone wall behind them. The explosion rocked the Sherman like a kicked drum. Joe bit his tongue, tasted blood. "Shoot now, or we're done for." Mitch screamed. "Ellis," Joe began, but Ellis didn't wait. The second shot roared from the cannon, a blur, a thunderclap. This time the shell hit lower, under the turret, between armor plates. It detonated like it had been waiting there all along. The Tiger didn't just explode, it came apart. The turret lifted into the air like a discarded helmet, followed by a geyser of flames that belched from every seam. The tank rocked sideways, slamming against the road's edge. Ammunition inside cooked off, one by one, in a series of deafening booms, and for a terrifying moment the fire turned an ethereal blue. Inside Joe's Sherman, the crew sat in stunned silence. The Tiger, the myth, the monster, the one every Allied soldier feared, was gone, burning, broken, beaten. Mitch sat down hard against the hull, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "That's two. 2 goddamn Tigers." Ellis let out a nervous laugh that turned into a cough, his eyes fixed on the flames. Joe didn't say anything. He just watched the fire, his expression unreadable. Then the shockwave hit. An unseen German artillery shell, maybe aimed blindly, maybe just cruel luck, landed not 10 feet from their left tread. The blast lifted the tank off its suspension. A blinding burst of light, sound, and heat slammed into the crew like a solid wall. Everything went white. Joe's ears rang with an unbearable pitch. His head hit the side of the viewport with a sickening crack. He felt a sudden warmth on his wares. Not heat. A wet warmth. Blood. Ellis was yelling, but Joe couldn't hear him. His vision blurred. Someone was grabbing his arm. The tank was hissing, something sparking ominously. Mitch was shouting into the radio, but the words came through like garbled static. Joe blinked once, twice, then looked down. A jagged piece of shrapnel was embedded in his side, just beneath his vest. Deep. Dark blood poured through his shirt. It didn't hurt. Not yet. It was just cold. He slumped back into his seat, his hands still on the controls. Outside, the Tiger continued to burn, its wreckage lighting the fog in hellish shades of orange and black. Beyond it, the Canadian convoy, battered but alive, began to move again. They were safe now, because of him. Ellis leaned down, his face a mask of terror. Joe, you're hit. Say something." Joe blinked, then managed a half-smile. "Tell command. Objective secured." Mitch's voice cracked. "We need a medic. Now." "No time," Joe murmured. He turned his head slowly, looking out the small rear mirror. He saw smoke, fire, mud, a trail of destruction that stretched back across the ridge, through the orchard, to the first dead Tiger. Everything they'd done, everything he'd driven through. Backwards. Joe chuckled softly, the sound weak and rasping. "Guess I really did fight the Nazis in reverse." His eyes started to close. Ellis grabbed his shoulder, shaking him. "Hey, no, you stay with me. You hear me? You're not going out like this." But Joe was already somewhere else. The roar of engines faded. The fire became a distant glow. He saw Nebraska wheat fields, his dad's calloused hands on a tractor wheel, the familiar smell of diesel and fresh earth. He whispered one last sentence. "Tell my mom." I didn't back down. I backed them up. And then silence. A hero doesn't return. When the radio finally went silent, the war around them did not. Artillery still rumbled somewhere beyond the valley. Smoke drifted across the ridgeline like a shroud. The air smelled of burnt metal and gasoline, a scent that would never quite wash off the skin. The Sherman sat half sunk in the mud, its armor scarred and pitted, its barrel still warm from the final shot. The crew had stopped shouting. There was nothing left to say. Ellis climbed halfway out of the hatch, gasping for air. He could hear distant cheering. Canadian troops, realizing the Tigers were gone, the road finally open, but inside the tank, victory felt hollow. The world outside was moving on, but Joe was not. Mitch was beside him, pressing a rag against Joe's wound, his hands slick with his friend's blood. "Stay with me, Joe. Hey, come on. You hear me? We made it." Joe's eyes fluttered open, the light a painful blur. His voice was a faint rasp, roughened by dust and agony. Did they get through?" "Yeah," Mitch said quickly, his voice thick with emotion. "They're safe. You did it, Joe. You did it." A slow, ragged breath escaped Joe's chest, a sound caught somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. "Good," he whispered. For a few seconds, the three men sat together in the profound stillness. No orders, no radios, just the soft, dying hum of the engine. The fog outside glowed a ghostly orange from the burning Tiger wrecks, casting long, trembling shadows inside the tank's steel womb. Joe's hand slipped from the control lever and brushed against the floor. He could feel the cold steel vibrating faintly, the heart of the machine still beating even as his own began to falter. He looked at Mitch and then at Ellis, his eyes glassy but clear enough to find their faces in the gloom. Don't be scared to back up," he murmured, each word an effort. "Sometimes, that's the only way forward." Mitch swallowed hard, a knot tightening in his throat. "Don't talk like that, Joe." But Joe offered a faint, tired smile, the kind of small, calm expression that meant he already knew. He tilted his head back, staring through the narrow slit of the periscope. Above the drifting smoke, he caught a glimpse of open sky, pale blue, vast, endless. It reminded him of home. Nebraska in the summer. The smell of diesel from the old tractor, his mother's hands covered in flour from the kitchen, the chirping of crickets at dusk. For one perfect fleeting heartbeat, he wasn't in France at all. He was home. The cacophony of the battlefield faded into a quiet hum, like the slow turning of gears winding down for the last time. His breathing grew shallow. The blood on his chest was no longer warm. His fingers twitched once, a phantom gesture, as if shifting gears one final time. Then his hand went still. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. For a long while the crew didn't move. The only sound was the wind whispering through the shattered trees. Ellis finally lowered his head, his broad shoulders shaking. Mitch looked down at the floor, his lips trembling, unable to form words. Outside, the sun began to break through the fog. Golden light spilled across the valley, washing over the burned-out remains of the Tigers, the torn fields, and the battered Sherman that had refused to yield. The price of one life. Canadian medics arrived minutes later. They found 2 shaken, battle-worn soldiers and 1 fallen driver. They covered Joe with a tarp and, with a piece of chalk, marked his name on the side of the tank. Private Joseph R. Johnson, killed in action. The Canadians would later say they had witnessed unbelievable bravery that day, but they struggled to describe it. How do you explain a man who fought the greatest tank of the war by driving away from it? That night, as the smoke settled and a mournful silence crept back into Normandy, Ellis wrote a single line in his notebook, words that no one else would read until years later. He never looked like a hero. He just refused to let us die. He didn't retreat. He reversed the odds. Joe was buried 2 weeks later beneath a small apple tree near Comont, his grave marked by a simple wooden cross with his helmet resting at its base. The Canadians insisted on conducting the ceremony. His own unit was too deep in the front lines to return. No grand speech was given. There were no reporters, no military funeral. just the low hum of wind in the orchard and the quiet scrape of shovels in the French earth. But the story of what he did spread like wildfire. They said he killed 2 tigers in under 10 minutes. They said he drove backward the entire time. They said he saved 37 men and opened a path that helped turn a stalled retreat into a counter-offensive. At first, officers dismissed it as battlefield rumor until they saw the wreckage for themselves, until they spoke with the men he'd saved, until they found the charred body of a Tiger tank commander with a field map marked with Allied retreat lines, showing exactly where Joe had cut them off. Back home, the story made its way into the local newspaper in Seward County, Nebraska. The headline read, "Local farm boy turns the tide in France." His mother wept as she read it. She hadn't yet received the telegram. The War Department eventually confirmed his actions. He was posthumously awarded the Silver Star, the citation describing extraordinary tactical improvisation under direct enemy fire. But the men who served with him, the ones who owed him their lives, didn't call it tactics. They called it guts. In the months that followed, tank crews across the front began to adopt what they jokingly called reverser drills, practicing backward retreats, using smoke to create blind zones and targeting Tiger weak points from non-traditional angles. Joe's name was never printed in any official training manual, but among tankers it became shorthand for a certain kind of thinking. Bold, unorthodox, desperate, but deliberate. The kind of thinking that saves lives. When the war ended, a group of Canadian soldiers returned to that ridge and replaced Joe's wooden cross with a permanent stone marker. Carved into the granite were just 3 lines. Private Joseph R. Johnson. He did not retreat. He reversed the odds. The field where he died grew quiet again, eventually covered in wildflowers and rusted shrapnel. But once a year, on the anniversary of the breakout from Normandy, a Canadian veteran would visit. He'd bring a small bottle of bourbon, place it on the stone, and sit for a while in silence. Because he knew what the official reports could never say. Joe Johnson didn't just stop a tiger. He stopped fear from winning. Most war stories end with medals, memorials, or parades. But not this one. This one ends on a slope in Normandy, where a muddy Sherman tank still rusts beneath the weeds, its treads frozen in place, pointed not toward glory, but away from it. Backwards. Joe Johnson didn't write memoirs or come home to tell his story. He left behind no letters, no speeches, no battlefield declarations. What he left was a trail of decisions no one else dared to make, a strategy no manual ever taught. He left a single moment where fear screamed, "Run!" And instead, he stood firm by turning around. It was reckless, perhaps even suicidal, but it worked. Not because he was lucky, not because he was stronger, but because he saw what others couldn't. That sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is not charge ahead. Sometimes heroism sounds like grinding gears in reverse. Sometimes saving 37 lives looks nothing like a Hollywood charge. And sometimes the man you laughed at during training becomes the name you whisper when everything goes dark. So here is the question his story leaves behind. In a world that celebrates only forward motion, would you dare to stop? Would you dare to turn around? Not out of fear, but because it's the only way to keep the people behind you alive. Because courage isn't always a step forward. Sometimes it's knowing exactly when to take one step back.